All right, so let us begin. We are on. Depends on the day. Samech Zayin Amud Beis. Okay, Samech Zayin Amud Beis. We are up to Samech Zayin Amud Beis, 67b1, and we are on the bottom of the first column, 67b1. Amar Ula Amar Rav Yochanan. Okay, Amar Ula Amar Rav Yochanan. Karpaf. What is a karpaf? A karpaf again is a place that is enclosed. It's a large place that is enclosed. I shouldn't say that. A karpaf is any place that is enclosed that is not enclosed for residential use. So typically, they would have these enclosed, basically sometimes like these back, like a back, it was typically used like we mentioned yesterday to store wood, or people would have these like places which is not, you have a house, typically you have a house and then you have a fence around the house. A karpaf is something which is fenced up, but it's not fenced up for residential purposes, it's fenced up for non-residential purposes, like it doesn't open up into a home. That's the basic definition of a karpaf. A karpaf is something which is fenced in, but it doesn't open into a home or a living space, but nonetheless it's fenced in. Okay, so we're going to discuss the way we look at it from halacha. So Amar Rav Yochanan, karpef yasser bebeis asayim shelo hukaf l'dira. A karpef which is larger than two beisa, that was not enclosed for residential use. Vafilu kor vafilu koraim. Even if it's as large as a kor or even two kors, which is a very large space. Okay, so let's say it's a very, very large space, enclosed, but not enclosed for residential use. Hazorik l'socho chayiv. Someone who throws an object from Rishus Harabim into that space, you are going to be liable. In other words, despite its large size, and despite the fact that it was not fenced in for residential purposes, at the end of the day, if you throw something from a public domain into that space, you're going to be liable. You have to bring a karban chatas, like we did it by mistake. Why? Because that space, that fenced-in space, is a rishus hayachid. It's a private domain. My time, and the Gemara says mechitzahi, because at the end of the day, there are legitimate partitions. There are partitions there which make it a rishus hayachid. Ela shemichuseres dayarin. It's just that it lacks residence. So what it's telling us is like this: a karpef we treat as a karmelis. In other words, for most purposes, we treat it as a karmelis, meaning you can't go into one of these fenced-in places and pick up an object and start walking around that enclosed space with that object. Why? Because Chazal or sages treat it as a karmelis. Though at the same time, when they treat it as a karmelis, they don't override its natural, its more basic status as a rishus yachid. Meaning, mid'oraisa, biblically, a rishus yachid is anything that is partitioned with a proper wall. Okay, so once it's partitioned with a proper wall, we treat it as a private domain. Chazal came along and they said, okay, but when it's a place which is not used for a living space, then we're going to treat it as a karmelis and not as a private domain, but not going in all directions, only as a stringency. Right? So again, you have this enclosed space. And because it's enclosed, Rav Yochanan's coming along and saying that we treat it, that it's a private domain. Anything that has partitions is a private domain. And therefore, if you take something from a public domain to a private domain, you're chayav a karban chatas. You can't transfer objects from one domain to another. But don't think that because we treat it as a private domain, you could therefore carry things within it. No. At the end of the day, Chazal came along and treated it as a karmelis. It is not a full-fledged rishus yachid. It's ultimately Chazal treated as a karmelis, and therefore you are still going to be. It's forbidden, rabbinically forbidden, to carry something for amos within that space. Okay, so what comes out over here is when Chazal treat this thing as the most important fundamental principle that comes out is that when Chazal came along and treated something because of its size and because of its unique nature as a karmelis, that wasn't to remove its natural biblical laws, right? Because they still treat it as a private domain. If you throw something from public into that space, you're still going to be liable. It's just to add stringencies, right? But it's not going to be a leniency as well, that now that they treat it like a private domain, you're going, not to create leniencies, only to create stringencies. That's basically what comes out, okay?
In this particular case,
when it comes to a karma, not all the time. Well, but basically when it comes to these statuses, when it comes to these like locations, and Chazal come along and treat something in a more stringent fashion, when they a space, a domain, they treat it in a more stringent fashion. It's only to add stringency. But the original status is not going to be overridden, and therefore, there's still going to. It's only to add stringency, but it's not going to remove any other stringencies that already exist there before. Okay, so let's see. Basiv Rav Huna bar Chinana. We ask a question. Sela, we ask from a brisa. Sela Shriyam, a rock in the sea. Okay, so sometimes you have depends on the place. You have within the water. Okay, water is always treated as a karmelis. Water is it's not a rishus harabim. People don't travel there. Can't treat it as a rishus harabim, even if it's a boat. It's not like a ton of people traveling in the same place. So it's going to be considered like a carmelis. And let's say there's a rock that juts out of the water. Okay, but let's go into the dimensions of the rock. Gavoa asar v'rochav arba. Let's say it's 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide. Okay, so what is that? 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide. That is always considered a Rosh Hashanah. That's a classic Rosh Hashanah. 10 high, 4 wide. We don't carry from the surface to the sea or from the sea to the surface, right? We wouldn't go from the Rosh Hashanah to the water, and the water to the water which is a carmelis to the rock, and from the rock to the water. Okay, pachos mikan mitatlan. But if it's less than this, if it's shorter, if it's not 10 tvachim high, if it's shorter, then you are allowed to carry between the sea and the rock and the sea. Ad kama, how large may the surface of the rock be? That line where the Gemara is going to analyze where is it going on. Ad beis asayim, up to 2 beisa. Okay, so how large is the surface of the rock? Up to 2 beisa. Now the Gemara is not clear. The Gemara is going to clarify where was that line ad kama going on. Okay, but again, the Reisha talks about a Rosh Hashanah, basically 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide in the carmelis, and we say you're not allowed to carry from the Rosh Hashanah to the carmelis, or carmelis to Rosh Hashanah, i.e. the water to the rock to the water. Can't do that. Then it says, but if it's lower, if it's shorter, then you are allowed to carry one to the other. They're both a carmelis. And then it says this cryptic statement: how wide can the rock be? Up to 2 beisa. If it's bigger than that, then those halachas don't apply. Says the Gemara, aye, where this last line, where's it going on? Ilema seifa. If you want to say it's going on the seifa, on the last parts of the brisa, which was telling us that if the rock is shorter than 10 tvachim, you are allowed to carry between the rock and the water to the rock. Then beis asayim tvelo. It's true. If it's larger than two tza, you can't. V'hami carmelis the carmelis kamataltel. At the end of the day, all you're doing, meaning, let's say it's wider than two sa. So what happens? Meaning, normally in land, if something is very big, then we say, oh, it's no longer a private domain, we're going to treat it like a carmelis. In this context, who cares if it's a carmelis? At the end of the day, it's still, if it's 4 tvachim wide and 3 tvachim wide, at the very most, it's a carmelis. So who cares if it's 2 beisa, if it's very, very wide? At the end of the day, it's still a carmelis. And the waters are carmelis, so it wouldn't make a difference. So ella aseifa ella varesha, rather it's going on the first part of the brisa, and the way to read it is like this. Vachigamar, sela shabayam, a rock in the sea. Gavoa asar v'rachav rabba. If it's 10 tvachim high and 4 tvachim wide, you don't go from the surface, i.e., you don't go from the rock, which is a private domain, to the sea, which is a carmelis, or from the sea, which is a carmelis, to the rock, which is a private domain. Vadkama, but until what size could the rock be? Ad beis asayim, if it's 2 beis asayim. But what do you see from there? Hayasir beis asayim atatlan. If it's larger than 2 sa, then we treat it like what? Then because it's so large, we treat it like, even though it's normally a private domain, Chazal come along and treat that very large rock like a carmelis. We treat it, that's like a karpef. Alma carmelis he. You see that this rock is a carmelis, and what's happening when Chazal are treating like a carmelis? Meaning, again, what's the Brisa saying? The Brisa is saying that when the rock is very, very wide, and they treat it like a carmelis, no longer Rosh Hashanah, then you are allowed to carry from the water to the rock, and from the rock to the water, right? Again, what the Brisa said. The Brisa said, if you have a rock that is 10 tvachim high and 4 wide, it's a private domain, and you therefore cannot carry from the water, which is a carmelis, to the rock, which is a private domain, and from the rock, which is a private domain, to the water, which is a carmelis. Then the Brisa says, the way we're reading it now, ad kama, until how wide could this rock be, that it's forbidden to carry between the rock and the water, only until beis asayim. But if it's larger, if it's very, very wide, then what? It loses its status of being a private domain. It therefore becomes the rabbinic notion of it becomes this thing called a carmelis. And the Bryce is saying that then you are allowed to carry from the private domain, i.e. you're allowed to carry from this rock, which is 10 tvachim high and very wide, to the water and back and forth. So what comes out is when the rabbis came along and instituted a carmelis, which is a rabbinic thing, it also is allowing a leniency, right? Because really, biblically, this rock, once it's 10 tvachim high and once it's 4 wide, it's always a private domain. And Chazal are saying, okay, but it's very, very wide, we treat it like a carmelis. And therefore what? And therefore the Bryce is implying, I'm allowed to carry from the water to the rock and the rock to the water, which means we just created a leniency based on calling something a carmelis. This is a direct contradiction to Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan, it told us earlier, right? Rav Yochanan told us that when you throw something from a public domain into a carmelis, then you are going to be chayav. Why are you going to be chayav? Because at the end of the day, it's a private domain, and it's just missing a person living there. So even though Chazal called it a Carmelis, at the end of the day, it still maintains its status as a private domain. But here we see not that way. Here we see Chazal are saying, even though we're calling it a Carmelis, and it's going to provide a leniency that now I'm allowed to throw between the water and the rock. Right? So there's an inconsistency. So Amarava, so it's Yufta Rav Yochanan. So this would seem to be a refutation of Yochanan. So we're going to have three answers. Amarava. Madl Yado Tirutim Asnayai to Yufta, most of Leda Rav Yochanan. So again, these sharp words of the rabbis. Rava says, someone who doesn't understand how to reconcile Brisas, thinks they're going to, is trying to refute Rav Yochanan from this Brisa. In other words, if you don't know how to learn, don't ask questions. Okay? Don't worry. Feel free to ask questions, and you all know how to learn. Don't worry. But he says, if you don't know how to deal with Brisas, then don't ask these questions. So he says, Olam Aresha. Really, that statement, really you misread the Brisa. When it said Ad Kama, it wasn't going on it is going on the first part of the Brisa, but you're misreading it. This is how to read it. This is how it should be read. The Brisa said, again, the first part of the Brisa says that if it's 4 tzvachim wide and 10 tzvachim high, you are not allowed to go from the water to the rock, from the rock to the water. That's what it said, right? And then it says, but there's an implication. You can't go from the water to the rock to the water. But on the rock, on the rock, you're allowed to carry. Why? Why are you allowed to carry on the rock? It's a Rosh Hashanah. It's a private domain. Again, something which is 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide, it's a classic private domain. However, then so it's on that implication of the first line that the last line of the Brisa comes along and says. So meaning the Brisa just told us in the Resha, don't go from the water to the rock to the water. Why? Because Carmelis to Rosh Hashanah to everything. But then there's an implication. But on the rock itself, I could carry, okay, even though it didn't say that explicitly. And then on that inferred line, the Brisa now says, Vadkama, how large may the rock be that it's permitted to carry on the rock? Ad Beis Asayim, until 2 sa. Once it's larger than 2 sa, then the rabbis come along and say, it's a Carmelis, and you can't carry on the rock. But we've already...
I'm trying to figure out how he got onto the rock on Shabbos.
He was left there on Shabbos.
Right.
Woe is to him. I don't know. Life was tough back in the day. I don't know. Whatever. I don't know. Okay. He was on this adventure trip. He's on this adventure trip. I don't know. People are stuck in weirder positions. I don't know. Fine. Okay, Rav Ashi Amar. Rav Ashi gives another answer. Le'olam aresha. Really, this, like we said, it's going on the first part of the Brisa, but he's reading it in a different fashion. And he has a different way of reconciling this question with Rav Yochanan. Hein amru ve'hein amru. They the sages said, and they the sages said. What does he mean? Hein amru. They the rabbis were the ones who said karpef. We're at the 67b2 second column. Karpef yasser mesa saim shlohukaf l'dirai mentaslim bo elam amos. The rabbis were the ones who instituted that when something becomes a karpef, i.e., this rock, when it's very wide, when it's 2 sa and becomes a karpef, then you are not allowed to carry within it. Only within 4 amos. In other words, the rabbis came along and treated a karpef with a stringency, even though it's really a Krishus Yachid, and really you should be able to carry it through the whole thing. The rabbis came along and said, no, if it's very big, if it's very wide, then we treat it then it's something called a karpef, it's a carmelis, and you can only carry something a very short distance, you can't carry it more than 4 amos. They also said, you can't carry from a Rishus Yachid to a carmelis. Okay, so what does this mean? He's going to explain. Based aside, to Charlotte Tatsule Bekule. If the rock is 2 Beisa, okay, meaning 2 Beisa or less, right? It's not yet a Carmelis. You're allowed to carry within the whole rock, right? So again, if the rock is 10 tvachim high, 4 tvachim wide, and more than 4 tvachim up to 2 Beisa, you'd be allowed to carry within the whole thing. However, as the first part of the Brisa said, right? You're not allowed to carry from the water to the rock and the rock to the water. Why? My time of why? It's a full-fledged private domain. However, if the rock is larger than 2 Beisa, so that rabbinically it's now prohibited to carry through the area, the rabbis came along and said, okay, we're going to go we're saying as we'll see why in a second, but basically, once it's more than 2 sa, that you're not allowed to carry within it, there the rabbi said, you are allowed to carry from the water to the rock and the rock to the water. My taima, right? What's the reason? Dilma amr shesiyach gemurahi, because you may come to treat this rock as a full-fledged Rosh Yachid, and a person would come to carry within it. In other words, Chazal came along and said, wait, if we don't allow you, if we say you can't go take something from the water to the rock and from the rock to the water, right? again, let's go to this case. It's a very wide rock, and really, it's a Rishus Yachid, right? But Chazal came along and said, we're going to treat it like a carmelis. It's something called a carmelis, and therefore you can't carry within the rock, right? So, but now we're going to say that, so they don't want you carrying on. The basic objective of Chazal, when they came along and said something very large is a carmelis, they don't want you carrying within that space, because, let's understand why, because it's, because ultimately, it's too un-Rishus Yachid-like, and therefore they say it's more like Rishus Rabbin, because it's so large, it's like a public domain, we don't want you carrying on it, okay? Now, technically, but the problem is that, so now, second, I just want to say this right. Okay, so they're not going to allow you to carry within it, but now if they also prohibit you from carrying from the rock to the water and the water to the rock, you may say, why can't I carry from the rock to the water, the water to the rock? Because it's a full-fledged private domain, right? Meaning, why can't I carry from the rock to the water to the rock? Oh, because it's not a public domain, it must be that it's a private domain. So I might come and think to myself, wait, the rock is a private domain. Oh, if it's a private domain, I would be allowed to carry. And then I would end up going, meaning when they came along and said treat it like a carmelis, you may go ahead and since it's also Rishus Yachid, meaning biblically it's Rishus Yachid, and therefore based on the biblical prohibition, I'm not really allowed to carry from the rock to the water, water to the rock, right? And I therefore will not be transferring objects from one to the other. And I think to myself, why can't I do that? Oh, it's a private domain. Private domain? Okay, well then I'm allowed to carry within it. But then the rabbi's decree of saying you can't carry within this large space would not happen. So what the rabbis do in such a case is say, listen, it's a Rishus Yachid, and therefore, biblically it would be a Rishus Yachid, and I would not be able to carry from, well, not biblically, meaning it's Rishus Yachid biblically, but the water is what? The water is a rabbinically prohibited place. It's called a carmelis, right? Which biblically doesn't really have a status, right? So the rabbi said, you know what? You could transfer objects from the carmelis to this rock, and from the rock to the carmelis, from the rock to the water when it's very large. Why? Because if they don't do that, if they don't permit carrying between the two places, then you may say, oh, because it's a private domain, which is true. And therefore, when it's very wide, and they're saying, oh, I'm not allowed to carry from one to the other, I say, why can't I carry from one to the other? Oh, it's a private domain. A private domain, I carry things throughout the thing. And therefore they say, no. When we are going to come along and say, it's a carmelis, and therefore we're going to treat it like carmelis all the way through. And you're not going to be able to carry on it for tzvachim, which is what you can't do on a carmelis. And we will allow you to go from the rock to the water, water to the rock, because the water is a carmelis, and the rock, Chazal are treating as a carmelis, and therefore, so that you will ensure that you treat the stringency of treating the rock surface like a carmelis, we'll say you are allowed to go from the rock to the water and the water to the rock. See what's happening over here? Right? Now.
So they're not like going over a biblical, they're helping with their carmelis thing.
Exactly. Rav Yochanan's case is a biblical case. Rav Yochanan was talking about going from a biblical public domain to the carmelis, which was biblically Rishus Yachid. And he says, you're liable. Right? So we said, oh, you see, whenever the Chazal make a carmelis, they only take the stringencies. And Rav Ashi says, slow down. Depends on the case. Certain cases where they have the flexibility, i.e., it's our case over here, it's all rabbinic, because the water is a carmelis, which is rabbinic, right? So there they have the flexibility. So to ensure that we will treat the surface of the rock with the right stringencies when they come along and treat it like a carmelis, because it's very wide, they will permit carrying from the water, i.e., a rabbinic space, a carmelis, to the rock. Even though it's a Rishus Yachid, they have the ability to do so. Okay? Umayshna. And why do they do one in one way, one in the other? Because tocho shchiach, carrying on a surface is common. But carrying from the surface of the sea and the sea to the rock is not as common. And therefore the rabbi said, I want to ensure the common case is still going to be held of, right? We're going to have the stringency of the common case, which is the top of the rock. We want to make sure you don't carry there, and therefore we treat it with the stringency of a carmelis. But from the rock to we treat it the stringency of a carmelis, and from the rock to the water to the rock, there we say, okay, we're not going to hold on to the stringency of saying Rishus Yachid to the rock in order to ensure that we hold of the more common case of the rock surface. Okay, now we go into a story. Okay, 67b3. Ahu Yenuka dishtapech chamime. Okay, so in Talmudic times, it was understood, it was believed that hot water was critical for a child after they have a bris. And before and after they have a bris, they would wash the baby. Okay, nowadays, modern science says it's not critical. But based on the fact that modern science of their time said it was critical, therefore was seen as a real necessity, you really had to get hot water. And what happened? Of course, the water spilled. Sorry?
They were probably also dirty.
That's true. Okay, they may be right. So they maybe understood it was hot water, not cold water, whatever it was. Okay. But bottom line is it was something which they felt was necessary. Amlu Rabba, Naitu Le Chamime Migai Baisai, bring hot water from my house. Okay, he lived in the same area, and he said, bring hot water from my house to the house over here. Amalei Abai said, hello, Arvinan. There's no Eruv. So Amalei, Nismach HaShituf, we'll rely on the Shituf. Okay, Eruv is in the Chatzir, Shituf is in the Mavoi. We're going to get into like the differences, we're getting into all the details in a very soon. So Amalei, Halashatfinan. There's no merger whatsoever. Shituf is the broader merger, Eruv is the more limited one. Bottom line, he said, there's no merger whatsoever. There's nothing that allows us to carry. There's no Eruv, there's nothing. So he says, no problem. Nemru Leila Nachri Laitule. Go tell a non-Jew to go get the hot water. Okay, go tell a non-Jew. Amar Abaye says, Abaye lasuvi lamar v'lo shavke Rav Yosef. I wanted to question Rabba's ruling, but Rav Yosef kept on holding me back, saying, don't ask any questions, okay? Why? Amar Rav Yosef Rav Kahana, because Rav Yosef said the name of his teacher of Kahana, Ki avinam be Rav Yehuda Amar Lan, when I was in the yeshiva of Yehuda, he would tell us, Bidoraisa, in biblical matters, if a posek wants to say something, a lenient thing, Mosvidin Tiyufta v'hadar avdina maisa. We first ask all the questions we can, and then only then do we do the action. Bidoraban, when it comes to a rabbinic thing, if someone makes a psak, then avdinan maisa, we listen, v'hadar mosvidin tiyufta, and then we ask questions. Okay, we treat, so basically, we're in the middle of a ruling. He just ruled. Don't ask questions. It's a rabbinic question over here. We rely on the postek's ruling, and then after, we'll ask questions. So let him do what he paskin to do. Okay, lebasar hachi amarle. So fine, bottom line is, they brought the hot water, the baby had his bris, all was good, yay, mazel tov. Okay, but now that's all over, we said, my bais la'asvei lamar. Now Rav Yosef turns to his student and says, what do you want to ask? What was your question? Now that it's done, it happens, what was your question? He says, Amarle Tanya taught, Hazashvos, Vamir Lanachishvos. It was taught in a brisa that sprinkling the water that's mixed with ashes of the paradum on Shabbos is a rabbinic prohibition. We're not going to talk about why right now, but the bottom line is it's a rabbinic prohibition to sprinkle water, the purification water, on a person who's tameh, and it can't be, it's a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbos. Vamir Lanachishvos, telling a non-Jew to do something is a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, 68.1. Ma Hazashvos Venadochas Shabbos, just like the sprinkling water, it does not override Shabbos. Let's say a person wanted to be tahar on Shabbos, we say, too bad, we don't sprinkle you on Shabbos. So too, telling a non-Jew to do something is a rabbinic prohibition and should not override Shabbos, even when it's facilitating performance of a mitzvah. So Amarle, Rav Yosef answers, don't you differentiate between shvus deis bei maisa, shvus deis bei maisa, between the rabbinic prohibition of telling a non-Jew to do something which involves an act which is biblically prohibited, okay, which is, to shvus, to rabbinic prohibition of telling a non-Jew something which does not involve a biblical act, Damar lo amar lanachri zil achem, because he did not say, go heat up the water. In other words, over here, what are you asking the non-Jew to do? To carry between two domains, one being, a full-fledged private domain, and the other being a Carmelis. That's a rabbinic mitzvah, a rabbinic prohibition, and that you're telling the non-Jew to do that. Okay? Whereas, in other words, he's saying, had we told him, go heat up go heat up water for the bris, that we would not do. That's a biblical prohibition, even though it's for the sake of a mitzvah, right? But over here, it's something to a rabbinic thing, something rabbinic for the sake of a mitzvah, that we would allow him to do. That's there's a big debate because there are different versions of what the text is in front of us, and this has massive ramifications. According to the text we have in front of us, what's coming out is that if it's a rabbinic prohibition, right? Let's say it's turning on a light to do a mitzvah, a light, modern light, which is not biblical because we treat LED lights like rabbinic, right? So if you tell a non-Jew turn on a light for the sake of doing a mitzvah, let's say people are sitting in the dark and they want to daven, and you say, so it's a group of people, whatever people are davening, and you say turn on the light so we could daven, that would be allowed because it's rabbinic, right? Whereas if it's something which would be biblical, let's say turn on, light some candles, that would be biblical and that would not be allowed.
You couldn't ask a guy to bring your kid to shul for his bris on, for example.
If it would be, you would be allowed if it's going to be like an our typical place. It's not full-fledged public domain. It's a Carmelist. Most of our places are Carmelists, right? Then it would be allowed to to say carry the kid to here because that would be you'd be stuck there by the way all of Shabbos because you can only bring it to shul, not home. But we'll worry about that later. But the bottom line is that would be permitted. There are different ways of reading this which don't differentiate between biblical and rabbinic, just differentiate between mitzvah and non-mitzvah. And there is an opinion that says for mitzvah you'd be allowed to ask a non-Jew even to do something doraisa. There's big debates throughout the ages about whether you're not allowed to ask. There was a big custom back in the day at the end of Yom Kippur they would have the non-Jews come in and light candles. And there was a massive debate, and it's based on how do you read this Gemara. That's a biblical prohibition. Were they allowed to do so for the sake of a mitzvah? Most poskim say no, only rabbinic things. But based on what the version of the Gemara is, there are those who say that even biblical things you would be allowed to do as long as it's for a mitzvah. Okay, another discussion for another time. Have a great day.